My name is Christine Delbridge, and I'm with the Canadian Hydrographic Service. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the recent work that we've done to analyze CHS's bathymetric data holdings, in Canadian waters, in an attempt to create more of a clear and concise picture of the state of bathymetric data coverage in Canada. So first of all, just a bit of a background on CHS. So we're part of the federal family, so part of the Canadian government. We're part of the Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and we're the organization that's responsible for producing and maintaining official nautical products, as well as tides and water levels information, maritime zones and boundaries. We have 4 regional offices across the country, and we're headquartered in Ottawa. So the particular group that I work for is called the Hydrographic Data Access Center of Expertise. So we have representation from all the regional offices, and our aim is to make data more accessible to the more general scientific population, outside of our official navigation products, something we haven't necessarily done the best of in the past. So we've been kind of working on that to improve that. So as Jessica alluded to, one of our big initiatives has been the development of our non-navigational bathymetric data product, or what we lovingly call the NONAs. So it's a consolidation of all of our bathymetric data, and it's free to the general public for non-navigational use. It's available in both 10 meter and 100 meter resolution. It's available, we encourage people to access it by open data. This is the government official website. So there you can access health documents, metadata, and things like that. Or you can access it directly at data.chs-shc.ca. So yeah, so the online portable, and then we also offer OGC services, so WMS and WCS data connections. So we recently released version 3 of the data portal. So in version 3, it's the updated version of the data itself. So as of 2022, there's also been updates to the interface. So you can see that we now have layers here that you can click on and off, and then also packages. So instead of downloading individual 10 meter or 100 meter cells, you can download packages of larger areas. So we've gotten a lot of requests and demand in the past for offering that to people who are looking at more of a broader area. So so you can download larger geographic areas. And now everything also in the product is on what we would call like a presently adopted chart datum. So it's a standard uniform vertical datum. Most of our data was already, the majority was on presently adopted chart datum already, but now we've done a lot of work to clean up kind of the outstanding data sets that didn't conform to that. So now we can confidently say like the product is presently adopted chart datum, depending on the local area. So going on to the Gab Analysis project. So the genesis of the Gab Analysis, CHS identified a need to analyze our bathymetric data holdings. We didn't really have a good way to answer, a seemingly simple question, how much of your jurisdiction is fully mapped or surveyed. So as many of you know, the answer is not quite that simple, but we needed to find a good way to be able to communicate the level of data coverage using simple and non-technical terminology. So we knew that NOAA had taken on a similar initiative to this. So we wanted to align our methods to allow for a binational analysis. And I'll talk a bit more later in the presentation about kind of differences between our methods. But thanks to Meredith, she provided us a lot of good information and kind of giving us some guidance on how to go about our work. So yeah, so the objectives, so understanding to the extent of bathymetric coverage, also to set a baseline to measure our progress, and enhance our existing planning tools, and then support other initiatives like JEPCO and of course Lakebed 2030. So first, to set things up, we'll talk about a bit about what is a gap and what isn't a gap, and how we went about determining that. As far as just a bit about how our data is actually managed. So we're using Teledyne Keras' Bathy database, and the data is stored as individual surveys, so we don't maintain like a master surface or anything like that. So here you can see the bounding polygons of all the survey objects. There's metadata associated with all of those objects, including like the technique of sounding, positioning, survey dates, sounding accuracies, positional accuracies. So here, this screenshot is showing a bit of Georgia Bay. So it appears as though the area is well covered, but we'll see in the next slide how maybe that's not the complete story. So we'll also note here that, the center part here, we're not showing any data sets, but we do have soundings. So just, I guess, a note that not all of our data sources have been loaded into our source bathymetric database. We do have some older analog data sets that we're working on getting them loaded. CGS is actively working on that, but our database right now isn't necessarily reflective of all of our data sources. So here we've zoomed in a bit of an area to see the actual data. So it's a mix of LiDAR, multi-beam, single beam. So different sounding densities, different line spacings. And so how do we decide here what is a gap and what's not? So we needed kind of a standard way to analyze that and to classify. So here's the methodology that we used. So we first create a base layer using coastline, the EEZ, international borders. So then the areas within these limits were considered our study area. And then we divide the study area into 100 meter by 100 meter cells. We use the Canada-Albers projection because it's designed for large areas, and it does a pretty good job of preserving like true ground cell coverage. So for each of these cells, we then classified into 4 categories: a gap, voice soundings, minimal coverage, moderate coverage, and full bottom coverage. So then just getting into a bit deeper on the definitions of these classifications. So with full bottom coverage, we're talking about data sources that were collected by multi-beam, LiDAR, or sweep acoustic systems that are capable of surveying full bottom. Resolution obviously varies depending on the system and the depth, but for this analysis, we're considering anything collected by these methods as full bottom. So moderate coverage is anything that has greater than 3 representative soundings, and I'll get into a little bit later what our definition of representative soundings is. And then, so yeah, either at least 3 representative soundings from other methods, or partially covered by a multi-beam or LiDAR sweep. So minimal coverage is no multi-beam, LiDAR, or sweep data, and only 1 to 2 representative soundings, and then a gap, which is 0 soundings. So each 100 meter cell will be classified as one of these 4 classifications. to do this, the first step was to classify, to create two separate layers of our data sources. So one, the multi-beam, LiDAR, vertical acoustic sweep systems. So anything within that bounding polygon, mainly gridded data, but not all. We were considering that full bottom. And then the other acquisition techniques, most of this data was in point cloud format. So those were the two different data sources that we kind of grouped together. So for the first group, so for simplicity and kind of limiting the processing resources required of dealing with the actual data itself and doing this analysis, we use the survey bounding polygons. So in this example, the dark purple would be considered full bottom coverage because it's fully contained within the bounding polygon of the let's say it's multi-beams, of the multi-beam. And then the lighter pink would be considered classified as moderately coverage because it's only partially covered by the multi-beam. And then this would be, well, no data coverage unless there's happens to be single beam or something in there. I'll get to that on the next slide. So for single beam and other data sources, we looked at the data itself because the bounding polygons aren't really appropriate to use because they contain sparser data. So you're going to kind of overestimate the amount of coverage you would have. So to classify the remaining study areas, we looked at the sounding density of these data sources. So we created a combine at 10 meters and then basically did a count of the representative soundings within a cell. So so the minimal coverage cells would be classified as anything like with one or two representative soundings, and moderate coverage anything that contains 3 or 4. So here in this example, so you can see say this is multi-beam, we'd have what did I count? 19 representative soundings. So this would be this cell would be classified as moderately mapped. Okay. So then just we try to align our approach as much as possible to NOAA's so that we can, when we're comparing our results to our friends down south, that we can could be comparing apples to apples as much as possible. So we both are using a 100-meter grid for this analysis. The biggest difference here is that we have an extra, I guess, tier. CHS, we're looking at full bottom coverage cells. So here, I guess we'll start at the lower end here. So a gap, we're both considering kind of a gap as being void of soundings. Minimal coverage in Canada is equivalent to minimally mapped, so that's 1 to 2 soundings. Moderate coverage, which is equivalent to better mapped with NOAA, 3 or more soundings, and then CHS has an extra level for full bottom coverage. What else did I want to note here? Yeah, so I guess one of the other important differences is that with NOAA, we're only including in our analysis data that CHS collects and maintains, which is generally data for charting purposes, whereas NOAA includes, well, you're including a greater number of sources, like some crowdsourced bathymetry, like anything that's in the DCDB, I think, correct? Yeah, okay. So yeah, so the sources are a bit different. And then, yeah, and then we're also using, I guess, the idea of representative soundings for our sparse data sources. So, if you have multiple soundings within that smaller 10-meter cell. We're considering that one sounding. And then I guess the other difference is NOAA is looking at data post-1960 only, whereas we've included all data source regardless of data collection. Anything that is currently loaded in our database, we're including in our analysis. Okay. Oh yeah, so drum roll. This is the result. So yeah, as you can see, the dark purple here is we're looking at full bottom coverage, and then as you kind of go down to gray, that's the gap. So we have quite a big gap in Canada. You know, 81.5% of Canada right now is a gap. Canadian water is a gap, and only 16.5% is what we're considering full bottom coverage. So we broke it down here, the Great Lakes. So again, 75% gap, with 13.7% full bottom coverage. As you can see, most of our coverage is in the more near shore area. Lake Superior. I think these slides will be available after if anyone's interested in getting these actual numbers. Lake Huron. And this is, we just kind of added this zoomed in area here just to kind of show in a more complex area what it looks like. Lake Ontario, a bit better percentages there. Lake Erie, we had a project the last couple of years, a few years ago now, this was in collaboration with NRCan to LIDAR. I think most of our near shore area of the Canadian side of the Great Lakes. It wasn't super successful in Lake Erie, so that's why you see in comparison to the other lakes, there's a lot more, I guess, kind of gray in there. Okay, so known issues. So we know this was kind of just a first cut at it. We do know it's not perfect and there are some issues. So the first one is the fact that we're using bounding polygons to kind of delineate full bottom coverage areas. We know that it probably is overestimating a little bit the coverage of the actual survey data, especially when you're getting in LIDAR, where you get some bottoming out here. The bounding polygon isn't detailed enough to be able to cut that out. So this, all these gaps in here are being classified as full bottom coverage, even though they're clearly not. So that's one known issue for sure. The other issue is not necessarily an issue, it's just more of a consideration, is with the depth dependency and whether 100 meters is appropriate to use in all areas. The footprint size, depending on the system, may be approaching 100 meters when you're in thousands of meters of water. So that's not necessarily an issue in the Great Lakes, but two soundings in a 100-meter cell, off of Baffin Island is a lot different than two soundings in 10 meters of water in the Great Lakes, right? So so do we want to have some sort of dynamic cell sizing analysis? Similar to what JEBCO does, but more on the smaller scale. I know JEBCO, I think it's between 0 and 1,500. They're using 100 meters. So we would obviously want to look, kind of subdivide that lower end of the scale. Anyway, it's just something that we're considering. Yeah. And future of Gab analysis. So this was just the first cut, phase 1. So future iterations, we're going to be looking at using the actual data itself in the analysis instead of bounding polygons to give it some more accurate calculation. And then also look at the depth considerations. We'll be incorporating this information into CHS priority planning tools for internal planning. And phase 2, which is actually being worked on right now, is automation. Right now, this process is really, it's really labor intensive, and so we'd like to find some way to automate it, especially if we're going to be running these numbers more often. And then phase 3, eventually we'd like to have, again, some sort of dashboard to be able to get this information out to the people who need it. So, you know, especially if you can make something more user interactive where people can select an area and that they're interested in, to be able to say, okay, how well is this area actually surveyed? So yes, we want to make this information more accessible for decision makers, be able to tell, you know, a clear story of where we're at in terms of bathymetric coverage in Canada. So, and that's it. So I'd be happy to take any questions.
Jim, go ahead.
Thanks, Christine. That was great. Really interesting to see that analysis, and exciting to know what there is and what there isn't. Is that something that would be available to share with other like the 2030 stakeholders? Okay. Would you be willing to share the data set with like the 2030 stakeholders? You mentioned that 2023, 2024 would be maybe publicly available, but
yeah,
that would be helpful for the 2030 plan.
Yeah, I'll have to ask my bosses about that, but I mean, I know the slides themselves are available to you folks, so I don't see any reason why that information wouldn't be available. So, sorry, the question was whether these stats would be available to the broader scientific community or broader Lakebed 23 community. I'll double check, but I don't see it being a problem.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. I think the talk about alignment between organizations and like-minded organizations. Just noticed the differences between how Canada analyzes and accepts their data versus how NOAA does that and see a much greater spectrum. So I have to wonder if the numbers would be different if you had opened that up for other data sources besides just the CHS digital products only.
Yeah, for sure. And Meredith and I have been discussing that a lot this morning. There's, you know, we tried to align as much as possible, but there are different nuances, right? And right now, CHS is not managing any crowdsourced bathymetry, and so we're only doing this analysis on what we're currently managing. So we haven't had any discussions. There's currently discussions at CHS about policies regarding crowdsourced bathymetry. In terms of a gap analysis on external data sources is not something that we've looked at, but it's yeah, it's interesting. I don't know that we're necessarily the agency to do that, but yeah, it's definitely something to think about. Yeah.
Another follow-up question I had is I'm curious to see perhaps know folks the rationale behind the 1960 date cutoff versus 1829 or 1815 data acceptance on the CHS model.
Yeah, I think that has to do with that's around the time that single beam systems were kind of more being the standard method, but probably that's the question for Meredith.
Positioning.
Oh, it's probably a bit more positioning, right? Yeah.
I'm not sure that it was a lengthy discussion when 1960 was sort of waved around, but I think it generally aligns with sort of the genetic positioning. And sort of, I think if we thought stuff, it was
a lot of mapping in the 1940s and early 50s in Great Lakes. And I think if we included that in our analysis on the US side, then our numbers would be higher. But maybe it's better to just say 1968, because we know that we want better than what we had before.
Right.
So there's a maybe in there.
The point that is a data set that's collected in 2022, 2021 more valuable to us than a data set that's collected in 2040s, or 18, in some parts of Canada, right? So just a balance from a prioritization on that, on those individual considerations. Thanks.
Other questions for Christine? Yeah.
So I'll ask my same question. So we're 7% of the American waters. What's the percentage of Canadian? What's the percentage of Canadian waters that we have data for versus, you say 7% of the American waters?
Are you talking about Great Lakes or all of
Great Lakes,
Canadian?
yes,
Okay.
yes, Lakebed. Oh, Lakebed.
I have to remember my audience.
Because we're gonna add more to the denominator.
Yeah. So these are the stats here. So right now, you were asking about the gap or about what's been covered?
What do we have data for?
We have data for about 25%. But
5%.
25%, but remember, we're looking at this at a scale of 100 meters. So even if 100-meter cell has one sounding, it's considered minimally mapped.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I don't know if either of you can answer this question. Looking at the map, is it a 50-50 split, or do we have more Great Lakes than you do? The averages, and I
Maybe the US.
we're somewhere between 7 and 25 or 23, but do you remember what's there? I'm trying to get up to 60%, so the Hans is happy.
So about 25%. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, we have to do a bit more in-depth analysis between the two of us, I think, to be able to come up with that number.
So since I'm running the US side, maybe just the observations, about 7% relative to the 25% on the Canadian side. And I think one of the other fundamental differences in the analysis is that we are counting what is publicly accessible through NCEI or if it's total LiDAR through NOAA's Digital Coast. And so we talked about this a little bit, even at the very beginning of the keynote when it came up. But there are underwater cultural heritage issues afoot, and there are surveys that have been conducted that have not gone through the full review, clearance to make those publicly available. So I think that if those were available, you would find our numbers would most certainly go up. And so if you look at Christine's analysis from CHS, all of those data points are internal. So they're not publicly acceptable, so they're not under that, they're not dealing with that screen. I feel like we are. Does that make sense?
Questions for Christine? So Christine, I have a question. When I look at your maps, it looks like there's a real emphasis on the near shore. So there's really two parts. Is that because you're using LiDAR systems as part of the mapping? And the second, or can you describe kind of what your priorities would be going forward in terms of what areas you're looking to map?
Yeah, so probably you could see a little bit better if we were zoomed in, but I mean, we're surveying for navigational purposes. So we're looking at main navigation corridors, and so that's probably why you're seeing a lot more, and also where it's areas more critical to navigation. So where the depths are more critical, so that's why I probably see more near shore, and then also the LiDAR campaign that we had the last number of years would contribute to that near shore density, data density as well. Yeah.
Are you willing to elaborate a little bit more on the issue you had with LiDAR mapping in Lake Erie?
All I know is that it was water clarity issues. Yeah, it just didn't go. It was water clarity the time of year. I don't know if at a different time of year we would have had better results. But yeah, we didn't have good results in Lake Erie.
Other questions for Chris? Oh. Excuse me, I was your LiDAR manager on that job, and
You can talk. You can.
I can elaborate. The reason why is that whole area, we had a whole bunch of pollution and algal blooms in that time of year. We actually chased some of them around to get that northern bit that you see there. So we were able to capture that, but as we kept stepping south and south, it just attenuated right away and so on. So we had beautiful waters everywhere else, but that last little bit, we just couldn't get anything. We blamed the U.S. working, I'm in charge of working for Canadians. We blamed the Detroit runoff pollution.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions for Christine? Well, great. Thank you, Christine, for being our British Canadian today.